is going to touch upon Kubrawī Sufism as well, from the perspective of music. So his paper is Music and Meditation, Kubrawī Sufi Thought and Identity Between Sound and Vision. Thank you very much. You have room to present.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and thank you to the organizers. I've really enjoyed all the talks so far. Yeah, right, so I'm going to discuss the Sufi discussions of sound and vision, and I'll really be trying to focus on how this relates to practices of the khirqa. I think one of the, I guess, benefits of doing this is sort of trying to show a very clear overlap between the intellectual and cultural and social history at the time. So I will chart Sufi theories and practices regarding music and musical audition, sama, and meditation or recollection, dhikr, to show how Sufis navigated questions of affiliation between sort of roughly the 10th to the 13th centuries, and then I'll focus on the Kubrawiyya as well, obviously. So the reason I consider vision here as well is that dhikr was associated with spiritual visions. And I mean, this sort of, anyone who knows about the Kubrawiyya will know that the dhikr was intended to produce these mystical visions of colors, etc. So I'll be using terms like ocular centrism and phonocentrism. But when I say ocular centrism, I just literally mean it as a hierarchy where mystical experiences of vision were considered greater than those of sound, not a sort of modern implication of rationalism or anything like that. Right, early theories of discussions of sound and vision occur in Sulami's text. Many of them are attributed to Ja'far al-Sadiq, and most of them sort of deal with this Quranic verse where Moses is denied a vision of God, and this is sort of contrasted to the experience of the Prophet Muhammad, who did receive a vision of God, not a vision of God, but is associated with vision in the Mi'raj, in the Ascension. So here, Ja'far al-Sadiq mentions that Moses heard from his Lord the attribute of Moses, whereas Muhammad heard from his Lord the attribute of his Lord. And because of this, the station of Muhammad was the Lot tree, the Sidrat al-Muntaha, and the station of Moses was the mountain of Tur, which Moses was unable to look at as well. So I'm sort of skipping a lot just to include everything that I think is relevant. But if we move on to al-Hujwiri, it seems that discussions between oculocentric and phonocentric frameworks of mystical experience became more sort of divisive. So he seems to react against ocular-centric mysticism. He starts his kitab, his chapter on Sama, saying the means of acquiring knowledge are 5. He mentions all the senses. And he says that 4 of the 5 senses are situated in a particular organ, but touch is diffused over the whole body. It's possible that this diffusion, which is characteristic of touch, may be shared by any of the other senses. And he seems to imply that it's hearing later on in the text, because he talks about how the eyes weep or the limbs move sort of unconsciously in response to sound. So, and then he gets even more explicit. He says, "Here, it's hearing then that makes religion obligatory, and for this reason, the Ahl Sunnah regard hearing as superior to sight in the domain of religious obligation, taklif. If it's said that vision of God is better than hearing, I would reply, our knowledge of God's visibility to the faithful in paradise is derived from hearing. It's a matter of indifference whether the understanding allows that God shall be visible or not, insofar as we are assured of that fact by oral tradition." And then he says hearing is superior to sight. So he seems to be making an epistemological argument that knowledge is associated with hearing only, not vision. So later on in the Kubrawī, so focusing on Majduddin al-Baghdadi, one of Kubra's main disciples, and Najmuddin Razi, who was also a prominent disciple of al-Baghdadi and Kubra. They initially, if you look at the discussions of Sama', they Majduddin Baghdadi seems to have a very high opinion of musical audition. He says the distance between bodily sight and spiritual sight is greater, but the distance between bodily sound and spiritual sound is smaller, and so sound affects the heart more quickly than sight, at least bodily sounds. Nevertheless, he makes clear, he says, Muhammad, again referring back to a similar argument that is attributed to Ja'far as-Sadiq, that Muhammad was a companion of sight and Moses, peace be upon him, was a companion of hearing, as God Most High has said, and he spoke to Moses with speech. And then he makes clear this is an indication that initiation onto the path occurs with hearing and completion occurs with sight. And moreover, Kubrawī authors seem to diminish the importance of Sama' as a practice for the completed Sufi. So Najmuddin Razi in his Manarat Sa'irin says, "True hearing is not confined to manifest physically sensed sound, for he who attains true hearing has in his world unbound perceptions." So true hearing is beyond time and space. And if one acquires this true hearing, he has this spiritual hearing in the most mundane sounds. So the sound of a well, bird song, or inanimate objects, creaking doors. He'll hear something that is spiritually significant. But the effect of that is to sort of diminish the importance of Sama' in a way for spiritual completion. And both Najmuddin Razi and Majduddin Baghdadi say there will come a time for you when musical audition is equivalent to the cry of a crow. For the power of audition over the heart remains only in the absence of witnessing. So again, mushahada is placed above sound as a spiritual experience. So it's necessary to sort of recognize the relevance these practices had to the material culture of Sufism. Recollection and audition were intimately connected to Sufi investiture and clothing practices. This had a direct effect on the organizational structures of the Sufi institution as well as the emerging Sufi publics. So in the earlier period, audition, Sama' seems to be the primary way through which Sufis created networks of loyalty and belonging. And examples of that is, for example, Hujwiri suggests that if one member of the audience begins to throw off or tear his garments in ecstasy, his fellow listeners should do the same. This would be part of the sort of kinesthetic and affective training a Sufi was expected to undertake. And he furthermore says that if the garment is thrown off without an intention as to who should take possession of it, Al-Hujwiri recommends that the Sufi master should not bestow it upon the singer, but that every attendee should contribute a garment so that they may be torn to pieces, distributed among the Sufi members in attendance, and used to patch together new garments. Textiles were, in this period, were extremely economically significant. So the production of textile was perhaps one of the most important industries in the Muslim world. They were inherited, passed down through generations. In some cases, textiles were used as currency, stockpiled. They were easily liquefiable. So yeah, they were important commodities, which the Sufi community would share as a sort of, they're sharing affective states, spiritual experiences, as well as economic assets. And so in light of the economic significance of clothing, as well as the medieval culture of investiture, it's clear that ritualized communal tearing and redistribution of clothing, which took place in Sufi auditions, functioned as a way to strengthen community identity and belonging. But in later Sufism, and here I just have this image to show that the garments are represented, and you have sort of a hierarchy of attendees at the Sama', so the sheikhs at the top, not really dancing or anything, and the initiates at the bottom dancing. I mean, I know this is much later, but the idea that the completed Sufi in the later medieval period doesn't move or dance, it seems to become more prevalent. So Al-Hijwiri also mentions that the way in which Sufis were sewing patched garments marked them as belonging to a particular community. So to take pains in sewing patched frocks is considered permissible by the Sufis because they have gained a high reputation among the people, and since many imitate them and wear patched frocks and are guilty of blameworthy acts, and since the Sufis dislike the society of others than themselves, for these reasons they have invented a garb which none but themselves can sew, and have made it a mark of mutual acquaintance and a badge. So in this way, there's a distinction between members of the community that engage in Sama' and others, or the appropriate kind of Sama', let's say. By contrast, discussions of what to do with a torn garment during audition are totally absent from Kubrawī discussions. On the other hand, Omar Suhrawardi, who was more involved in formalizing relationships between Sufi publics and Sufi institutions, in a lengthy, in his Awarif al-Ma'arif, does have a lengthy discussion of this, and he also distinguishes between khirqat al-tabarruk and khirqat al-irada, so a robe of blessing and a robe of investiture. This two-tiered system is really not present in early Kubrawī writings, to my knowledge, at least. Najmuddin Razi even mentions that garments shouldn't be torn. And in the case of the Kubrawī investiture, what we see is more of a displacement of Sama' as the main way through which Sufi identities are being constituted, to a more centralized mode of bestowing garments after the disciple completes a successful sort of 3 years of training, which involve dhikr. Al-Baghdadi, for example, employs the term libas with respect to both the physical textile which one drapes around the body, as well as the bodily expression of the soul's attributes. These attributes correspond to visualizations in the forms of colors during recollection. He argues in emulation of the Prophet that Sufis must perfect their attributes before perfecting the outward appearance of clothing. So initiates are only given robes after successfully completing their training. And he furthermore emphasizes that the Sufis should wear the colors that they perceive in their visions. So the initiates would wear blue, and or dark blue, which is common in other Sufi practices as well. But I mean, the reason being visions, that they have visions in dark colors, is sort of particular to the Kubrawiyya. On the other hand, Sufi sheikhs wear white because, I mean, the perfected vision of God can't be contained in an image, and white is considered a sort of absence of color. On the other hand, Najmuddin Razi, I think, switches to black, but I mean, there are other reasons for that. So the emphasis on the correspondence between the inner state and the outer appearance of the Sufi occurs in a context of settled Sufi communities with clearer hierarchical structures. And this shifts the discussions regarding the practicalities of clothing. So in earlier Sufism, the idea was initiates would wear blue because they'd be traveling a lot, rather than seeing blue in their visions. So in essence, you have this very stark distinction between patched robes produced in auditions and robes that are given after successfully completing dhikr or recollection. So the more collectivized form of investiture found in al-Hujwiri's discussions of musical audition is hardly mentioned in early Kubrawī sources. The association of robes with recollection accompanies the displacement of musical audition and hearing as the primary ritual through which one's Sufi identity is constituted, in favor of recollection and an emphasis on visual experiences. So the robe that's bestowed upon Kubrawī Sufis, yeah, as I've mentioned. I mean, even you can see that this association becomes even stronger in the later periods. So with Ala ad-Dawla as-Simnani in the 14th century, he mentions receiving a khirta al-Dhakira from his master Nuruddin Isfarani. Simnani presents this robe as having the same chain of spiritual transmission recounted by al-Baghdadi through Kubra and stretching back to the Prophet. So it seems that eventually spiritual lineage was conflated with learning the practice of recollection, at least in Simnani's time. And yes, I think I'll conclude maybe a little bit early, but yes. So my overall aim is to show how discussions of sound and visions were connected to particular Sufi practices. These inform the ways in which Sufis cultivated gestural, affective, and sensory responses to certain stimuli. And as we have seen, this was also intimately connected to the material culture of Sufi communities and the sort of organized systems of belonging amongst the Sufis. And particularly, you can see a distinction with the Kubrawiyya, who are have a very much have a more restricted mode of the early Kubrawiyya, have a more restricted mode of allowing association with the Sufi institution. Yeah, thank you.